Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to have a discussion about the union budget and also the economic survey. 2023-24 economic survey is out. Just like every year, the economic survey has been released, and also on just before the day of the submission of the economics union budget, economic survey has also been released. So in this video, in this class, we'll be going to have a discussion about the union budget of 2023, 23 and 24. And along with that, we'll be discussing the economic survey as well, the key highlights of both. And me, myself, Mohammed Shamil, and let's start. Before going into the dynamic aspects of the present budget, it's important that we understand some of the static concepts related to the budget. So what a budget is, what does the idea of the budget comes from, what are the main features of the budget. So initially, we'll have a look at the static portions of the budget. The accountings of the budget are so important when it comes to the UPSC examination. We'll have a look at the accountings of the budget, the deficits of the budget. Then we'll have a look at all the static concepts in the light of the present budget. And also, we'll juxtapose or we'll do this thing simultaneously with the findings or the major areas with the economic survey. That's how we are going to approach today's class. To start with, what is a budget? So technically speaking, if you have a look at your constitution and all, you do not see a term called as budget in your constitution. The term that comes up and that keeps on repeating is something called as the AFS or the annual financial statement. So the constitution calls this an annual financial statement. Now, what does an annual financial statement or a budget do? You think about an individual. You think about, let's take me. I'm an individual. I'm earning, let's assume, I'm earning something like 10,000 rupees every month. So if my income is something like 10,000 rupees per month, I can afford to spend 10,000 rupees. Assuming that I'm not borrowing or does not have any past savings, this is my income and I can spend this much. But my requirements or my needs may be so high, it will not be something that will be limited to just this 10,000. I'll have my wishes or desires would be something like I would need a phone worth 10,000 rupees or a clothing worth 5,000 rupees. So the idea is you do not have money to meet all of your requirements, all of your needs. So, but you have to allocate differently. So you have to allocate a portion of this 10,000 into your clothing needs, into your food needs, into your sheltering needs, all these things. So just like an individual do this budgeting, the government or the state also has to do something of this sort. The state will have an estimate of the revenue, how much it is going to, the receipt, how much is going to get it over the next financial year. And also, the state will have to see where all this money will be spent, under which all heads this money is going to be spent. How much money is going to be given to the agriculture sector, how much money is going to be given to the industrial sector, and so on and so forth. So this is the basic understanding or the basic philosophy behind the budgeting. Just like any individual budgets, the government also budgets. And you see, it's very important for the governments to budget, because unless they budget, they will go out of proportions and they will run out of money and they will end up in huge turmoil. To avoid this, you need budget. So if you have a look at the Article 112 of your Constitution, it says about something called as an annual financial statement. And something called as an AFS has to be released every financial year before the starting of the next financial year. You know, our financial years run from April 1 to March 31st. So our present practice is to release the budget on February 1st. The first working day of February is when the budget is normally released. And this budget will kick in before the financial year ends and before the next financial year begins. Now, you have to be careful about a couple of terminologies over here. Normally, crudely, when we say the term revenue, we are thinking about how much you get. But in the context of budget, this becomes different. So it would be better to modify this thing as receipt and expenditure. In the context of budget, any incoming money is called as a receipt. Incoming money is called as a receipt, and an outgoing money is called as an expenditure. So the budget will have receipts as well as expenditures. So the budget will have separate entries which shows the receipts and separate entries which show the expenditures. We'll have a look at how the budget looks like, but this is the basic idea. Now suppose, let's say Nirmala Sitharaman comes up on February 1st, 2023 and say, we are releasing the budget for 2023-24 and they're introducing some new taxes. So there will be new taxes being proposed in the budget. The rates of the existing taxes will be modified, some increase, some lowered, etc., etc. in the budget. No matter whatever it is, so taxation can be a part of the budgetary proposal, but if it has to be implemented, you need the permission of the parliament. That's the basic idea. Now, there is a concept called as vote on account, and this has got something to do with the recent changes that has happened in the budgeting practice. For example, to take a financial year before 2017, let's take 2016. The next financial year was going to run from 2016 April 1 till 2017 March 31st. So the budgeting has to be done before this date starts, that is before April 1st, which means the budget is going to be presented somewhere in 2016 Feb, March. Earlier the practice was, it used to be submitted or like presented on the last day of February. So let's assume February 28, you're assuming like you're presenting the budget. So once it is presented, it has to go through a multitude of stages. Like there are around 6 stages it has to go through. So all these stages will take somewhere around 2 months, 2 or maybe even 3 months. So all these processes will get over by the end of May. So February last, you introduce a budget. By end May, you get all the clearances, all these type of things, and the fund is ready. But there comes a problem. The financial year actually kickstarts on April 1. The fund will come only in end May. So in April and May, you don't have finances. You're out of money for 2 months. So this out of money for 2 months is going to be problematic, especially in the context that in June, the southwest monsoon will start to kick in. So when southwest monsoon start to kick in June, many of the construction activities, infrastructure related activities can't work. So a whole lot of construction related activities, productive activities, those 2 months are lost. So what you do is, you do a vote on account. That is, for the 2 months, you do a temporary call as a vote on account. Now, however, recently what the government has done is, the NDA government in 2017, they thought of reworking the date. From February 28, they preponed the date to something like February 1st. Now the whole process of budgeting gets completed before the end of February, before the end of March. So now from April 1 onwards, you have a full-fledged budget before you. The money is ready even before April 1. In that scenario, you need not have a vote on account for the just 2 months. So this is the idea behind vote on account. Now, in 2019, government still decided to go for a vote on account. Why? Because it was an election year. In election years, the norm is that even if the government, let's assume, whichever government is in power in February of that year, let's assume February 2019, they have the liberty of presenting the budget. But there comes a problem. What's the problem? You are not sure about whether you're going to stay for the next 5 years or not. If the election comes in May and a couple of months later, you might be out of power. And if you're going to have a full-fledged budget for 12 months, that's going to be very problematic for the next government. So the practice is that 12 months, what you do is, in these election years, you go for an interim budgeting, not a full budgeting. And in interim budgeting, you do a vote on account. The idea of a vote on account is to make sure that until the next full government comes and they introduce a full-fledged budget, you are going to have at least a minimal amount of money that can be used for your expenditure requirements during the said period. Now, Now, this is something so crucial when it comes to our understanding of the budget with regarding the UPSC examination, because this is something very interesting or like of for UPSC to test you upon. UPSC has a habit of asking you questions, especially in the prelims on this. And interestingly, even in the 2020 mains examination, they asked a question on this, a very static question out of this, just this figure. If you had you under, have you known this figure, you could have very easily got a very high proportion of marks out of that. Now, this is basically about the accounting practice of a budget. You have the union budget or the government budget, not just the union budget, even the state government budgets look like this only, look similar. Now, this budget may be divided into capital budget or capital account or a revenue account. See, you need to distinguish between the terms revenue and receipt from here. Normally, we have a practice of calling or seeing these two terms or using these terms interchangeably. But for the purpose of our budgeting, we are going to treat these two terms differently. Receipt is any incoming money. Revenue is something else. What is that something else? I'm going to explain. Now, you have your capital budget, you have your revenue budget. So, what is a revenue account or what is a capital account? I'll give an example. Suppose the government, the last year the government decided to disinvestment Air India. Air India, which was a public sector undertaking, was disinvested during the said period, right? So what happened over here was government sold off an asset. So when you are selling an asset, your assets reduces, right? When the amount of assets that you have is reducing. But when you sell Air India, you're getting money. The Thales Group, which bought Air India, gave the government the money. So it is a receipt. Government got the money, but the government's assets reduced. Or there could be other cases whereby government decides to spend money and create a new bridge project. In that project, a bridge is like a long-term asset for the government. The asset actually increases, but the government is spending money. So as a result of both of this, some change is being seen in the government's assets. A different example could be like, let's assume the government is taking loan from somewhere. Let's take the Indian government is taking loan from the World Bank. So if the government is taking loan from the World Bank, any loan that you have taken is the liability. So if you take a loan, your liabilities actually increases. On the other hand, let's assume you already have some loan that has been taken from IMF and you are repaying that loan. When you repay an existing loan, your liability actually reduces. So when you're taking a loan, you get money, that is a receipt, but your liability increases. But when you're giving or repaying your existing loan, that is an expenditure, but your liability reduces. So how do you understand what a part of the budget? Is it in a capital account or is it in a revenue account? The basic idea is, if something happens to your assets or liabilities, then it is a case of a capital account. Any government expenditure or a government receipt which results in a changing in the government assets or liabilities is a capital expenditure or a capital receipt. If it's an incoming money, that's capital receipt. If that's an outgoing money, that's a capital expenditure. Now, what about the revenue budget? Let's assume the government is collecting taxes. In the process of collecting taxes, is there anything happening to the government's assets or liabilities? Absolutely nothing happens, but the government is getting money, right? So this is an example of a revenue receipt. What about government giving a subsidy? Government giving out a subsidy means the government is spending some money and it is an expenditure. But is something happening to the government's assets or liabilities? Absolutely not. So that is an example of a revenue expenditure. So if nothing is happening to your assets and liabilities during, that is part of your revenue account. And if something is happening as a result of some transactions, your assets or liabilities, that is part of your capital account. So this is how you distinguish any entry or any transaction or any spending or receipt of the government on the revenue account as well as the capital account. So the revenue receipt will have largely tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Non-tax revenue could be anything like the interest that you might receive on some loans that you have given long time back, or it could be the case of any any fees that the government gets as a result of some of its payments, etc., etc. And even within the tax revenue, you can have this direct tax, indirect tax. Now, regarding these expenditures, when you have a look at your NCRTs, they will have a couple of columns which would say plan expenditure and non-plan expenditure. Both in the revenue side, you will have a revenue plan expenditure, revenue non-plan expenditure. Capital, you will have a capital plan expenditure, capital non-plan expenditure. But these things are outdated. Once the Niti Aayog came up in 2015, post the disbanding or dismantling of the planning commission, you do not have this classification into plan and non-planning anymore. So this is how it looks as of now. Now, there are certain terms which are called as the deficits, the 4 deficits which are important from examination perspective. We'll have a look at the deficits slightly over here. Then we'll have a look at the government's present budget. Then we'll have an examination of those. So any budget you think of can be 3 ways. Any budget can either be a deficit budget, or it could also be a case of a surplus budget, or it could also be a case of a balanced budget. So what does this mean? If the government is spending more than what it is receiving, let's assume the government is getting something like 100 crore, but they are spending only 90 crore, which means they have a 10 crore surplus. That is the case of a surplus budget. And on the other hand, if the government is getting 100 crore and the government is spending exactly 100 crore, that is a case of a balanced budget. And contrary to this, let's assume the government is getting only 90 crore, but they are spending 100 crores. In that case, if you're getting only 90 and if you are to spend 100, the only way is you have to take loans. So those type of budgets are what you call as the deficit budgets. So there are different type of deficits when it comes to the budget. For example, something is at your call is it's called as the revenue deficits. It's about the revenue expenditures and revenue deficits. We'll have a look at this thing, and then we'll have a look at these deficits formally. Okay, this is something called as the budget at a glance of 2023-24. Every year, once the budget is released, there is an organization called as PRS Legislative Research. They comes up with something like this. So this is a very crispier or a very concise way of understanding how our budget looks like. So when you have a look at your budget, there are going to be different entries over here. So you will have your revenue expenditure. Revenue expenditure would mean all those expenditure that did not affect your assets or liabilities. On the other hand, you will have capital expenditure. Capital expenditures are those expenditure which had some impact on either your assets or your liabilities or both. And the capital expenditure may again be divided into capital outlay and loans and advances. See, the capital expenditure that the government has can either be a capital investment. For example, if you're constructing a new road, if you're constructing a new bridge, etc., etc., etc. All those are what you call as capital outlays. And capital expenditure could also be something, a loan or an advance. It's an expenditure, which means it's going out of the government's coffers. So if the government is giving some loan, that is also a capital expenditure. So capital expenditure could either have some investment or some projects, etc., etc., or it could also have a loan component. So these two are part of capital expenditure. Now, the revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure would give you the total expenditure. On the other hand, you have the revenue receipt side over here. You have the revenue receipts. Revenue receipts are normally the receipts like the taxes that the government receive, the interest payments that the government is receiving, all these type of things. And capital receipts would be something like recovery of loans. If the government has given some loan sometime earlier, if the government is getting this money back, that is a case of a loan recovery, and that is a capital receipt. Or even disinvestment that I was referring to, that is the selling of Air India, where the government is selling some of its public sector undertakings. Those are also avenues in which the government gets money, and also government is reducing its asset, which means it is a case of a capital receipt. Now, if you add the revenue receipt plus capital receipts, you will get the total receipts, excluding borrowings. I hope this much is clear. Now, what are these things? Actuals 2021-22, budgeted 2022-23, revised 2022-23, and budgeted 2023-24. Now, let's assume the 2023-24 financial year kickstarts on April 1st. And April 1st, 2023, and it is going to be there till March 31st, 2024. This is the period where the budgeting has been done. Now, this budget has been actually introduced on what date? February 1, 2023. So when the government is speaking on February 1 about the next financial year, which is going to come 2 months later, the government do not have any actual data. All they have is some hypothetical estimates in their mind. So that's what the budget estimates is all about. Similarly, if you have a look at 1 year back, let's assume the budget for the previous year, that is 2022-23, might have come on February 1, 2022, right? When the government must have released this budget on February 1, 2022, they would have had a budgeted estimate for the financial year 2022-23. This is 1 year back. But now we are speaking about the situation on February 1, today. Today is February 1. And 1 year back, you had budgeted estimates for 2022-23. Now you have previous financial year, you will have the actual data. So what we are interested in over here is the budgeted 2023-24 data. So this is our present financial year where the government is speaking about these expenditures on all the budgets. So you'll have the revenue expenditure, which is something like 35 lakh crore. The capital expenditure is something like 10 lakh crore. This itself gives you some idea about our budget. This will give you an idea about which is the substantial portion or the major portion of our budget. That is, the revenue expenditure is much higher than the capital expenditure, more than 3 times. This is a basic fact that you need to know when you go to the exam hall. So this fact you should keep in your mind, that the revenue expenditure in case of India is much, much higher than the capital expenditure. So if you add these two, that is the revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure, you'll come up to a figure which is called as, which is around 45 lakh. This is what you call as the size of the budget. The overall expenditure of the union budget is something like, of Indian government's union budget, is 45 lakh. Now, of this 10, the 10 may be obtained by adding these two components, the 8.37 and 1.63. Now, you come by the previous year. The previous year's budgeted estimates was something like 39.44 lakh crore. So the government expected the budget size to be somewhere like 39.44, and it has actually increased. This is another thing that you need to keep in your mind. That is, the size of the budget is in fact increasing. So, but what is this anomaly? The budgeted estimate was something like 39.44 lakh crore, and the revised estimate was something like 41.87 lakh crore. This means no matter how much the government thinks, every year the actual expenditure or actual size of the budget is going to be slightly different, at least slightly different from how much you have envisaged it to be. So that's basically about the expenditure side of the story. What about the receipt side of the story? So we said the government is spending 45 lakh crore, but the government is receiving around 26 lakh crore as revenue receipts, and another 84,000 crore rupees as capital receipts. You add these two, you get your total receipts, which is something like 27 lakh. Now you can see a huge gulf. Government is spending 45 lakh crore and they are receiving only 27 lakh crore. How is that even possible? You see a difference of something like 18 lakh crore, right? 45 minus 27, something or less than, something slightly less than that. How is this difference managed? That difference is managed by borrowings. And that is exactly what you call as fiscal deficit. The fiscal deficit is the difference between the revenue expenditure and the total expenditure and the total receipts, excluding borrowings. See, even borrowings actually comes as part of your receipts. But if you count your borrowings, then this will be zero. Without, you exclude borrowings, you take your total expenditure minus total receipts, excluding borrowings, you get this figure something like 18 lakh crore, and that is what you call as the fiscal deficit. And you need not by heart this figure and all, but this figure you need to by heart, the 5.9. That is the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. That is, if you take fiscal deficit on a numerator, and your GDP on the denominator, how much is it going to be? It is going to be something like 5.9%. And that figure you need to by heart, and that is an extremely important figure, and we'll show the trends of this figure with respect to your budgeting. Give me a second. Okay. Now we said about one of the deficits, which is called as fiscal deficit. Now another deficit that we are going to have a look at is something called as a revenue deficit. So revenue deficit is the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipt. So here you see, I'll clear all these markings, which will make things clearer. Okay. The revenue expenditure, which is budgeted for 2023-24, is something like 35 lakh crore. That's your revenue expenditure. That is on your revenue account, what you're going to spend. On the revenue receipt is going to be something like 26 lakh crore. So the difference between this 35 and 26 is something like 8.69 lakh. So this is what you call as revenue deficit. So revenue deficit is a difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipts. So that's a very simple thing to study. You have your revenue deficits. And what is your fiscal deficit? Fiscal deficit is the difference between total expenditure and total receipts. But in the receipts, you have to exclude the borrowings part. So for this present financial year, your revenue receipts is going to be something like, revenue deficit is going to be something like 2.9%. Then you have another figure which is called as your primary deficit. So you have this 17.86 lakh crore, which is the actual magnitude or the quantum of like borrowings, right? From that, you subtract something called as X. What are you subtract? You subtract your interest payments. See, any government, you take the Indian government, it must have taken loans over a period of time. Here itself, you can see there is a fiscal deficit of 17.86 lakh crore, which means it is a loan amount, right? So this is not just this year, the previous financial year, previous to previous financial year. All this financial year, you must have taken loans. And for all those loans, you will have to pay back interest also. So from the fiscal deficit amount, if you subtract the interest burden of the government, you get primary deficit. Fiscal deficit minus the interest burden will give you something called as primary deficit. So something that is explicitly understood is the primary deficit is going to be anyway less than the fiscal deficit. And also the revenue deficit is also a subset of fiscal deficit, which means in the case of an economy like India, the revenue deficit is also going to be less than fiscal deficit. Then you have another deficit, a slightly tricky deficit, which is called as effective revenue deficit. So effective revenue deficit would be something like, okay, I'll use this thing only. You have your revenue expenditure, right? Which is something like 35 lakh crore. In the accounting practice, if there is any grant, it is put in the revenue accounts. Grants, all the grants are put in under the head of revenue accounts. It's either a revenue expenditure or revenue received, depending upon the direction of the movement. Now, you think about the union government giving a grant to the state government. So let's say the union government giving a grant like something like, of this 35 lakh crore, I'm assuming that the union government is giving a grant of 5 lakh crore to the state governments. So it's a grant. So it will be there in the revenue expenditure. So when you calculate the revenue deficit also, this thing will come up, right? But of this 5 lakh crore, the states has the liberty of deciding how to spend this money. When they have the liberty of spending this money, they will think about, they have two ways of spending this. This 5 lakh crore can either be spent on your revenue expenditures or your capital expenditure. Simply put, if the state get a 5 lakh crore rupees, they can decide to either give subsidies on this money or either create some infrastructure. That's it. If you're creating an infrastructure that's causing some changes on your assets, that is a capital expenditure. If you're just giving subsidies, if you're just giving pensions, nothing is happening on your asset side, that is example of a revenue expenditure. So it's a choice of the states. At least a portion of this 5 lakh crore the states can decide. So when the states have this form of liberty, what they would do is, of this 5 lakh crore, let's assume a 3 lakh crore they are spending as revenue expenditure. Another 2 lakh crore they are spending as capital expenditure. This 2 lakh crore, this is actually capital expenditure. But this 2 lakh crore is part of the 5 lakh crore that is being given to the states. This 5 lakh crore is actually part of this 35 lakh crore. This 35 lakh crore is actually revenue expenditure. So this is part of revenue expenditure, but in reality, this is a capital expenditure. So this is like a capital expenditure within a revenue expenditure. I hope you get, it's a bit tricky. So the 35 lakh crore stays as revenue expenditure in the central government's accounts. Why? Because all grants are put in revenue expenditures. Of this 35 lakh crore, 5 lakh is given to the states as grants and it stays in revenue expenditure. This 5 lakh, from this 5 lakh, the states decides to spend 2 lakh crore for capital expenditure, which means it's capital expenditure, but classified as revenue expenditure, which means you have your revenue expenditure actually is not this thing. So you introduce a term which is called as effective revenue expenditure. That is, this 35 lakh crore is your revenue expenditure. From that, you subtract this 2 lakh crore, you get a figure called as 33 lakh crore. This is your effective revenue expenditure. Now, when you calculate your effective revenue deficit, you take your effective revenue expenditure and from that, you subtract the revenue receipts. So this is going to be something like 33 minus 26 instead of 35 minus 26. So this is going to be slightly different. Like say, this effective revenue deficit is going to be something like 7 lakh crore, whereas the revenue deficit is going to be something like 9 lakh crore. This 7 lakh crore is what you call as effective revenue deficit. And the 9 lakh crore or 8.69 lakh crore that we were referring to is the revenue deficit. So these are the 4 deficits. And you should be so clear with the idea of the deficits before you go to your prelims examination in such a way that let's assume someone calls you out of your sleep and asks for what these deficits are, you should still be able to answer. That should be your level of understanding that is required for this with regarding these deficits. Okay. Now, the budget. When you have a look at your budget, the government releases a document which is called as budget at a glance. This infographic is taken from that document. Just this infographic, there is a whole set of infographics that are taken from that particular document. And it's a very beautiful document to see. So they will have, every year, the government's budget at a glance will have two images, two pie charts to be precise. One pie chart would be saying about where rupee comes from, and the other would be saying that where rupee goes to, where each rupee is coming from and where each rupee is going to. So, where does money come from? Let's assume the government gets 1 rupee, which means 100 paise. Of the 100 paise, 15 paise or 15% of the government's total receipts are coming from income taxes. Okay. Another 7% is like income tax, like personal income tax. That's the income tax people like you, me, all pay to the government. And in addition to that, you can see corporation tax also. What is this? This is the corporate income tax. So 15 paise or 15% is coming from personal income tax. Another 15% is coming from the corporation or the corporate income tax. So the total income tax turns out to be something like 30% of the total incoming money to the government. Now, the excise duty is something like 7%. What is excise duty? An excise duty is a duty that is paid. Union excise duty is a duty that is paid to the union government when production of something happens. This is not sales. This is only when there is some production happening. So that's like a 7%. Then you have GST, normally on the sales of goods, something like 17%. Then you have customs duty, which is something like 4%. Then you have non-debt capital receipts. Of your capital receipts, let's assume all your capital receipts, a portion of it is debt creating, a portion of it is non-debt creating. That is, if you're taking a loan, that is a capital receipt. Why is that a receipt? Because you're getting money. Why is that a capital receipt? Because when you're taking a loan, your liability increases. So that is debt creating capital receipt. At the same time, there could also be a capital receipt, which is non-debt creating. What is that? In the example that we're speaking about, you're disinvesting something. That is a capital receipt, but that is non-debt creating capital receipt. So all these type of things that we are referring to, that's that 2%. Then you have non-tax receipts. That's like the interest payments that you are receiving, all these type of aspects. Then borrowings and liabilities. See, this is the single most important component over there. The largest source of incoming money for the government is nothing else, but it is just the borrowings and liabilities. That comes to the tune of something like 34%, whereas your direct taxes is just how much? 30%. You see, your direct taxes is something like 30%, which is 15 plus 15, right? Your borrowings is way higher. It's around 34. What about your indirect taxes? How is it going to be? It's also going to be not much different. You take this 15, you take this 7%, you take the GST is 17%, that's 24 plus 4. That's something like 28%. So your indirect taxes is something like 28% of your total incoming money. Your direct tax is something like 30% of your incoming. And borrowings is going to be something like 34% of your incoming money. So which is the highest portion? That's like a very potential question for your prelims. And also we have some metrics called as the tax to GDP ratios. So in Indian case, the tax to GDP ratio is somewhere between 10 to 11%. It keeps fluctuating within this range year on year. That is, tax to GDP ratio would be the total amount of tax the government gets divided by the GDP. So it is in this range, 10 to 11. What about the direct tax to GDP ratio and the indirect tax to GDP ratio? Both are like almost similar, but this year the direct taxes are a bit higher than the indirect taxes. See, this is not a welcome thing. Ideally, your indirect taxes should be higher than your direct taxes because of the whole idea of the progressiveness of the direct tax. We had discussed about this in our classes on taxation. If you're interested, you may watch those classes for pretty much detail. Okay. Now, where does this go to? We had discussed about where the money is coming from. Where does this money go to? 20% go for interest payments. Is that something like very fascinating? It shouldn't be, because you see, if the government's largest incoming money is borrowings, it's large. If this is the pattern year on year, if the government is taking such a huge portion of money as loans every year, don't you think the government will have to pay a huge amount of money as interest every year? Obviously, that's it. That's what is being reflected over there. That's what the single large most important component of the government expenditure, which is the interest payments. Then you have government schemes. Centrally sponsored schemes get something like 9% of expenditure. Central sector schemes get something like 17%. I hope you know the difference between these central sector schemes and the centrally sponsored scheme. And for UPSC prelims, when you study, it's very important. Whenever you study a scheme, it's very important to understand whether there's a central sector scheme or is that a centrally sponsored scheme. In the case of a centrally sponsored scheme, is it a core scheme or is it a core of the core scheme, etc., etc. Now you have defense expenditure, which is something like 8%, subsidies 7%, states share of taxes and duties something like 18%, pensions something like 4%, expenditure something like 8%, finance commission and other transfers something like 9%. This is where the money goes to. So we have seen where the money comes from and we have seen where the money goes to, right? So we have said this is about the primary deficit. The primary deficit was actually introduced in 1993. Before that, we did not have such a metric. With regard to effective revenue deficit, it was actually introduced in 2011. The 2011 budget, Chidambaram introduced this. So here you can go through the slides. You will have an understanding about what the capital receipts are, what all these things come from, and also what the capital expenditures are, etc., etc. Now, fiscal deficit, I'll spend maybe a couple of minutes more over here. Fiscal deficit is total expenditure minus revenue receipt plus non-debt creating capital receipts. I've said what this non-debt creating capital receipt is. It is that portion of capital receipts which is not creating any debt. If you include the debt component, this fiscal deficit will come to zero. Then there is no point in calculating this. And the total expenditure is revenue expenditure plus capital expenditure minus revenue receipts plus non-debt creating capital receipts, right? So you do some readjustment. You take this revenue adjustment term over here and you take this term into the other bracket. This comes something like revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts plus capital expenditure minus non-debt creating capital receipts. The fiscal deficit now, this thing, revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts is what you called as revenue deficit. So fiscal deficit is a sum of revenue deficit plus something else. What is that something else? You have a term over there. So that is a relationship that exists over there. Now, the same thing that we are referring to, where does the government's money, tax money come from? Around 50% of the government's money come from direct taxes, not 50%, slightly higher than 50%. It's going to be 52% to be very specific. And in direct taxes, the remaining 48% comes over from them. Now, these are your deficit trends. These are of extreme importance when it comes to understanding the macroeconomy or the state of an economy with regard to India or any nation. So let's start. So we'll start with the axes. On the x-axis, you have the financial years 2008-9, 2009-10, 2010-11, 2011-12, 2012-13, etc., etc., etc. on your x-axis. On your y-axis, you have the percentage to GDP ratio, like the amount, what is the deficit to GDP ratio. And you have four arrows. One is this blue colored thing, like light, I'll call it blue. I think that's blue only. That's fiscal deficit, the topmost one. Below that, you have the red colored one, which is your revenue deficit. And at the rock bottom, you have something like, what color is this exactly? I'll call it purple. I think it's purple. I'm not good with colors, but I think I'll call it purple. Okay. So the purple color one, The purple color one is your primary deficit. Okay, it's fine. Purple P primary, you get a wrap over there also. Now you have a green colored one over here, which is called as effective revenue deficit. Now, I want you to have a look at these figures over here, 2008, 9, 2010. The fiscal deficit to GDP ratio were over 6%. Then it reduced a bit, increased again. Then it started falling continuously. After 2011-12, the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio has fallen continuously. Keep this in your mind. The fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, the fiscal deficit has fallen after 2011-12 till 2018-19. I want you to be very clear with this. Don't ever forget this. Why I say don't ever forget this is because UPSC has exactly a way of asking like this. Between these 2 years, 11-12 to 18-19, fiscal deficit has been falling. One second. Okay, now after that, it started increasing. In the financial year 2019-20, the fiscal deficit started increasing. See, 1920 was a period when the economy started facing a sort of recession again, not because of COVID. Even before the COVID, Indian economy was in a state of shambles. Its receipts were getting affected. Its expenditure was increasing. So the fiscal deficit increased. And come COVID-19, 2020-21, the fiscal deficit skyrocketed. Why would a deficit skyrocket? The skyrocketing of a deficit means the government's receipts are falling and government's expenditures are increasing. When you have situations like COVID, the government's receipts are coming down, which means the government is not getting taxes as it expected it to be. And on the other hand, the government's expenditure are increasing because the government have to give free food, the free subsidy, etc., etc. Then after COVID, it started moderating, and 2020 to 23, they estimated it to be something like 6.4. Present year, they have estimated it to be something like 5.9%. That's it. That is the trend regarding the fiscal deficit. What about the revenue deficit, the red colored one, which stays exactly below it? The pattern of movement is split too. Whatever is a pattern of the movement of the fiscal deficit, the pattern is same, but the magnitudes might vary sometimes. It's because a substantial amount of your fiscal deficit is revenue deficit. See, you take fiscal deficit, let's take any random year, that's 2012-13. The revenue deficit is 3.7. Plus that you add something like a point, I think the above one is 1.1. You add, but you get, that's what your fiscal deficit is. So the trend, the patterns are exactly similar, and the revenue deficit year on year is exactly lower than the fiscal deficit as well. Now you have effective revenue deficit. The trend is also very similar to the above two things. It has to be, because you take the effective revenue deficit, add something, you get revenue deficit. To that you add something else, you get fiscal deficit. So they are expected to follow a particular pattern because they have a large proportion which is constant or which is the same among all these things. Now, this data you have only from this period because that's when you started calculating them. And even revenue primary deficits, you can see this thing over. Now, what should be the takeaways over? Over the last 10-15 years, what has been the pattern of the deficits in India that you should be clear with? What has been the reasons for the rising and the declining pattern? The declining pattern is similar. No one is happy when your deficits are increasing and the government thought of reducing it. That's it. The FRBM, the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, would say to bring down your deficits to 3%. That's it, period. The fiscal deficit to 3% and your revenue deficits to 0%. That's it, period. And why did it go up later? That is another reason for query that you should be clear with. And one thing that you should understand is your fiscal deficit is expected to be higher than your revenue deficit, and your revenue deficit is expected to be higher than your effective revenue deficit. And also, your fiscal deficit is always expected to be higher than your primary deficit. These two relationships you keep in your mind. But you can't say any relationship regarding the primary deficits and the revenue deficits. Now, this is something, this shows the same things like what has happened to the government liabilities over the period of time. But it's not, the point of putting this slide or image over here is not to have a look at the percentage of government liabilities, etc., etc. It is to introduce a particular term over here, which you might not be, you might have heard a whole lot of times, but you might not be very familiar with the usage of that. There is something called as general government. Till now, we were referring to the term government, the government deficit, the government budget, etc., etc. When we are referring just the government deficit, the government liabilities, we are referring to the union government. Either you say union government or you say government, you are meaning the same thing. General government means the union government plus the state government. In combination, that's what the general government is all about. So general government liability means the liabilities of the union government and the liabilities of the state governments taken together. And you can see a pattern over here. The outstanding liabilities, it has been increasing year on year post 2015, and it achieved a maximum during the financial year 2020-21. Then it started moderating a bit. So this is a general pattern regarding anything. Now, when you go for your UPSC prelims or when you have an analysis of your previous question papers, something that's clear is UPSC have a habit of asking questions based on patterns. What is regarding the last 5-year pattern, regarding the last 10-year pattern. That's why I'm showing these pattern graphs. But some things that you should be clear with is 2020-21 was an exceptional or like an extraordinary year for an Indian economy or any economy as well. Almost all the patterns got broken in that year. One of the most robust patterns that you speak about is the GDP growth rate. The growth rate might fall, but the GDP is expected to grow year on year. Even that did not happen in the financial year 2020-21. So it is in this context, the patterns are mostly broken, but whenever you have a look at something from the economic survey of the budget, it is important that you have a look at the patterns. So thus, we are almost at like the end of the part 1 of this entire session. The next session, what we are going to have a look at is, we are going to have a look at specifically the 2023-24 budget. So before having a look at the specifically at 2023-24 budget, maybe we'll take a couple of minutes break, then we'll start. So this is about the static part of the budget. So we'll take a couple of minute break, then we'll meet for the remaining part of the budget. Okay, we'll start with the budget 23-24. So we'll start with some starters that the government, Nirmala Sitharaman puts out in the budget. So she will start every year when she puts out the budget, not just her, any financial minister normally had a practice of pushing out the bright side of the story. So it says, our current year's economic growth is estimated to be 7%. India is a bright star in the world where the economic growth is plunging or going down, etc., etc., etc. So to an extent, that's true because around the world, the economic growth rate is falling and India is one of the lone bright spots. Fair enough. So they say the economic growth is going to be 7%, but that is something that we'll have to wait out and watch. And government is saying that's the current year's growth rate. And government says that the next year, that's a budgeted year 23-24, the government is expecting a growth rate of 10.5%. And that's a nominal GDP growth. I hope you should be clear with the terminologies like nominal GDP, real GDP by the time being. So it's going to be something like 10.5%, the nominal GDP growth. And government says since 2014, the per capita income has doubled to something like 1.97%. 1.97 lakh. That's what the per capita income is, what they're saying. There are two things that's very interesting over here. One, why the year 2014? The year 2014 is not any year of some structural break or something in the economic sense of it. But 2014 is important because that's a period of a political break when it comes to Indian economy. Politically, you can call it as a case of a structural break. That's because that's when a new dispensation, the NDA dispensation, comes to the power. And when the government says the per capita income has doubled to around 1.97 lakhs, it does not reveal a whole lot of things. What has happened to the inequality? The inequality has increased, and whose income is this which has doubled? It is the income of the richest people. That's a different story which we have dealt in detail in a session which is about poverty and inequality, which is also part of our lecture series. Now, in these 9 years, India has increased its size from being the 10th largest economic nation to the 5th largest nation, etc., etc. And you can see a large number of the formalization of the economy, which is reflected in the increasing number of EPFO enrollment, the increasing number of GST registrations, etc., etc. Now, we'll start with a couple of graphs that come from the economic survey. We'll use the economic survey and the budget simultaneously. In financial year 2020, the Indian economy's real GDP was estimated to be something like 145 lakh crore. When COVID came, the size of it actually came down. So this dotted line or dashed line that you see is something called as the pre-pandemic level, right? Pre-pandemic level. So the idea of drawing a line like that is to understand whether your economy has bounced back above the pre-pandemic. When 2022 financial year came, that is a 21-22 financial year, that was the year when the COVID second wave and all came, we were well above the pre-pandemic year. And in the present year, according to the first advanced estimates, that is a 2022-23 financial year, not this is April, so in the financial year which ended March 31st, we are well above the pre-pandemic level. That's your takeaway from the figure on the left. What is your takeaway on the figure on your right? It says about the year-on-year growth of real GDP components. Your real GDP has been bifurcated or disaggregated into the primary, secondary, tertiary sectors. So you see your agriculture sector. This is your agriculture sector, the green colored one. Then you have your industrial sector, you have your services sector. Industrial sector, it went down and came up. Services sector was stable, then it went down and came up. So this line is a 0% line. If it goes below 0% means the sector is contracting and not expanding. So we are speaking about financial year 2021, which means that's a financial year when COVID came. And when COVID came, your industrial sector contracted, your services sector contracted. So very important takeaway, I have reiterated in many of the classes earlier also. But most importantly, agriculture sector overall throughout this period has been staying above 0%, which means it is the only sector in the Indian economy which has shown positive growth despite COVID-19 or despite the COVID-19 crisis at all. So that is a very important fact that you should keep in your mind. This would be a very interesting thing that UPSC could find it to test you upon. But in the present times, we are in a sort of a dilemma. We have a lot of issues to be dealt with. So the economic survey identifies triple shocks. The economic survey says that we had one shock, followed by another shock, followed by another shock. So we had three shocks. That's what the economic survey is speaking about. So when in January 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic started affecting the whole over the world. In India, it actually affected a bit of late, maybe around the March, April, May, around these times. So when this happened, there was a global output contraction, like the global GDP started shrinking. And India was also not much different. Indian GDP also started shrinking. People were not able to go to schools. People were not able to learn. People had lost a lot of income earning opportunities, etc., etc. Then, in February 2022, comes the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So, COVID came, economies fumbled, it was recovery. Then second wave came, It fumbled. Then it was recovering. Then came the Russia-Ukraine war. When this war came, the prices of many of the essential commodities, the commodity prices inflation has been increasing. Products like crude oil, products like natural gas, products like fertilizers, a whole lot of the raw material that is required for the production of all these things come from these two nations. And even the product prices of things like wheat and all. These two nations account for more than 1/4 of the global wheat production. All these things, the prices are increasing and inflation is the norm. So the situation has been problematic. Now what happens is, when the nations were recovering after COVID-19, the governments and the central banks thought like, okay, we will go for some expansionary policies. We'll try to put money in the hands of people. Let them spend and let the economy grow. That's how the policymakers thought. So there were expansionary policies, and the government and the central banks were trying to put money in the hands of the people. Good. But that's when the war came. When the war came, the inflation were increasing. When the prices or even the inflation is coming up, you do not have the liberty of putting in the money in the hands of the people anymore. Then what happened? The central banks around the world went for something called as synchronized monetary tightening. The central banks around the world started to reduce the money supply. The central banks around the world started increasing their policy rates, the repo rates or whatever it is. So as a result, there started to be a shrinkage of money in economies like US, the Western economies, etc. So when the US economy and these economies, advanced economies, started putting money in the hands of people, those people with those money came to nations like India, economies like India, because here there were large potential of returns. The returns were much, much higher than those returns that existed over there. So they came here, invested their money. But now, when the central banks over there started increasing their policy interest rates and the money had to be, there was a shortage of money supply, these people started taking their money back. And now we are witnessing an outflow of the foreign capital. And this is worsening our situation. This is worsening the current account deficits. And this is putting inflationary pressures, etc., etc. We have regarding the dynamics about this monetary policy tightening and regarding the current account deficit and how does it affect our domestic inflation and exchange rate. We have had very detailed discussions on our classes in our lectures. It would be better if you had a look on our classes on external sector. We had very good discussions, very detailed discussions of this. Now, after February 2022, that's when the war broke out, the US Federal Reserve started increasing the policy rate. So when the US Federal Reserve starts increasing the policy rates, many or large proportion of the funds that exist in nations like India, the foreign investment in India are coming from these places. These investors would take their money from nations like India and go back, and you can see the foreign portfolio investment equity flows during the January-December 2022 period was around minus 20 billion US for the Indian economy, US billion dollars for the Indian economy. And this is something that we have learned in our classes, which is called as the hot money effect that's being referred to. Now, these are the growth estimates. How much are we expecting our growth to be? In 2023, so it's like India is expected to grow something like 6.1%, which is much higher than the global average, which is something like 2.7%, which means India is definitely a bright spot, no doubts on that. Now, what is our budget has to say? What is our budget's vision on all these things? See, when you have look at the previous year's budget, that is a 2020 to 23 budget, the government was speaking about something like Amrit Kal. Amrit Kal is a period between 2020 to 2047. That is the period between India at 75 years of independence to the period between India at 75 to India at 100. Okay. So this time period is the period called as Amrit Kal. So the government in this budget says we are going to focus on the budget Amrit Kal, and we are going to create a lot of opportunities for citizens with a focus on the youth. And there's going to be growth and job creation, and we are going to ensure there's a strong and stable macroeconomic environment as well. Now, the government in this present budget identifies 7 focal areas to focus on so that the vision of the Amrit Kal is achieved. So the first focal area is agriculture. It's like the idea is about inclusive growth, that is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. So the government has identified agriculture to be a very important sector. Without focusing and solving the issues of agriculture, the government realizes that it is not possible to solve the problems that the Indian economy faces. I'm not going to have a look at each of these in detail. I'm going to have a look at the 2-3 major ones over here. Government speaks about creating, building digital public infrastructure for agriculture. We'll discuss what that is. And also it speaks about setting an agricultural accelerating fund. We'll speak about what that is also. The government also speaks about making India the global hub for millets. See, 2023 has been declared as the International Year of Millets. So millets is something that has been long neglected during our green revolution journey and all, but the benefits, the health benefits and all, or the environmental benefits of the millets is being realized these days. And the government, not just the Indian government, the nations around the world are realizing the importance of the millets. And we are trying to make India a global hub for millets. And now millets are being referred to Sri Anna, and the government is focusing a lot on this. Now, that's one thing that the government is trying to do as a part of the inclusive development or the Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Because millets were considered to be the food of the poorest people, whereas the rice and wheat were considered to be the food of the rich people. Now we are trying to have a look at trying to improve the farmer's income by promoting an additional crop. And another thing that the government is trying to do is to promote cooperatives. For example, one thing that the farmers in the rural India, one difficulty that they face is regarding storage facilities. After they harvest, they do not have adequate storage facilities to store their products, which means they are forced to sell their products, especially the perishables and all, at any price they get without realizing, or like they are without realizing any price that they really want to get, right? But the government is saying, or like, this is some criticism of the budget, or not just this budget, all the budget. Even when the government says that they're going to spend so much on the capital expenditure, the proportion of this capital expenditure that is going to the agriculture sector is absolutely distinct. So government is saying, we do not have funds to develop all the storage infrastructures in the rural areas. Instead, what we can think about is we can help you develop cooperatives. And for that, the government has even created a new Ministry of Cooperation, and they call it the Sahagar Ke Samriddhi. And the cooperatives will create storage facilities which the farmers can use. And as a result of this, the farmers will be able to store their food products and sell only when they are satisfied with the prices they get. Okay. And also the government is also converting around 63,000 primary agricultural credit societies on a cooperative model. So these are two things. One is about the millets aspect and the other one is about the storage facilities. Another couple of important things for agriculture. One is the Agriculture Accelerator Fund. So this is a sort of fund which will be set up to encourage the agriculture startup. See, we see a whole lot of startups around the nation. But how many of it have you seen to be focusing on agriculture? Most of these startups are either industry focused or service sector focused. Like you see a large number of fintech, edtech startups coming up, but you don't see anything on agriculture. So the idea of an agricultural accelerated fund will be to set up to encourage agriculture startup. So if there is someone who is interested in setting up an agriculture startup, the AAF or the Agriculture Accelerated Fund would support this entrepreneur. And as a result, it would bring innovating and affordable solutions for the problems faced by the farmers. So it's about bringing in the young generation, the technically skilled generation to create solutions for the problems of the farmers. That's one part of the story. Then the government also speaks about creating digital public infrastructure, DPI. See, the government has been speaking about the digital public infrastructure for a whole time. All these things like Aadhaar, UPI, all these are examples of digital public infrastructure, DPI. Okay. Now the government is speaking about DPI for agriculture. We are going to create a digital public infrastructure for agriculture. It is going to be an open source, open standard, and interoperable platform. So what will happen is it will have a whole set of data regarding the farmers, the crops, the weather, all these things. And it will help the startups, the agriculture tech industry to develop better products so as to help the farmers. This is the idea of having a digital public infrastructure. Now, this is something that we have already seen. Even during the COVID period, despite all the crises, despite all the problems that existed in all the sectors, the agriculture sector has stayed resilient towards and had shown positive growth. You see this year called as 2014-15. In 2014-15, the growth rate in Indian agriculture was minus 0.2. That is, it did not grow, it contracted. So that was the last time Indian agriculture contracted. And what was the reason for that? Obviously, poor monsoons. Another important thing or that you should keep in your mind is regarding the food production, like how much grains are we actually producing? So you just keep this figure at the back of your mind. The overall food grain production in India is something like 315.7 million tons, like more than 310 million tons. And this is a record figure. This is only the grains we are speaking about. That is the rice, wheat, and the coarse cereals. We are not speaking about oil seeds. We are not speaking about pulses. We are not speaking about horticulture, fruits and vegetables. If you take the fruits and vegetables, that's around another 300 million tons. So both will have more than 600 million tons. And more than the actual figures, what is interesting is it is a record figure. And over a period of time, we are actually seeing this increase. There is an increasing trend that you keep in your mind. Regarding oilseeds and pulses, we can't see an increasing trend. There is a phenomenon which is called as cobweb phenomenon. Cobweb phenomenon. What is a cobweb? Cultivate pulses this year? A large number of farmers cultivate pulses. This leads to more pulses or a good harvest of pulses. So the supply goes up. So when the supply goes up, there is a situation of excess supply. Prices come down or the prices crash. So that is in situations of glut, prices crash. When prices crash, these farmers think like they will not be able to get the returns that they expected. So the next year, the coming year, these farmers think, no, we'll not go for pulses, we'll go for some other crops. So the area under cultivation comes down the next year. In that year, the supply falls. When supply falls, the prices increases. When the farmers, so in this situation, the limited number of farmers who are actually cultivating pulses take good profit. By seeing this, the next year, the area under cultivation increases, supply increases, prices crashes, farmers are making losses. Next year, area under cultivation reduces, supply reduces, and prices increases. So this is like a chain. 1 year it increases, 1 year it reduces. This is what we call as the cobweb phenomenon. It's like the web of a spider. That's where it comes from. So with regarding pulses and oil seeds, what you see is a cobweb phenomenon. You can't see a clear-cut increasing trend with regarding the production. That also keep in your mind. Now, what does agriculture mean largely? Our typical or very crude understanding of agriculture could be something as the crop-based agriculture. all those wheat, rice, fruits, vegetables that you see around. That is one part of agriculture, very crucial and the larger part of agriculture. In addition to that, you have the livestock-based farming, you have forestry and logging, you have fishing and aquaculture. So if you take the entire agricultural GVA in 2020-21, around 55% of this is coming from the crop-based farming, which means if you take agriculture, more than half of the production or the value addition is coming from the crop-based cultivation. What about the remaining? Somewhere close to 30% is coming from livestock, and the remaining is coming from the forestry and logging and fishing and aquaculture. So the largest component is crops. But if you have a look at that green colored line over there, you can see that is actually reducing. This is something that you call as a structural shift happening within agriculture. Within agriculture, the dependency or the contribution of crop-based farming is falling. It is falling from 65 to 64 to 62 to 60, and now it is around 55. And over the years, as the years goes by, it is expected to fall further. This is not just a case typical to India. This is something that we see around the world. And when this is reducing, something has to increase, right? The livestock are increasing. Now, compared to the older times, today more and more farmers have livestock. It is seen as an insurance mechanism. If there is some crop failure, you still have some income, which might be your cow or your hen or whatever it be. So the livestock are actually increasing and the crop-based cultivation is actually reducing. And these are all very potential questions that you could that could come up for this. So that was basically about the Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas or inclusive development. Now, the second pillar for the achievement of Amrit Kal's goals, the government sees something very important as is the capital expenditures or the investment or the infrastructure creation. Now, why is something like infrastructure very important? The basic idea is because of its multiplier impact. People ask, I've seen people and students ask, why are we so much focused on infrastructure creation? Why can't we just use this money and give pensions or subsidies or etc. etc.? See, in economy, any nation, especially a nation like India, where you have very limited resources to meet all your unlimited amount of needs, you are speaking about cost-benefit ratios. You have a very limited amount of money or very limited amount of resources with you. With this very limited amount of resources, you need to meet a large number of needs, right? So when the government thinks about spending a money, they think about where will they get the maximum return. So if I spend 1 rupee in agriculture, it might come up as 3 rupees later. If I spend 1 rupee in industry, it might come as 6 rupees later. If I spend 1 rupee in infrastructure, it might come up as 20 rupees later. This is what you call as a multiplier effect. And infrastructure sector is a sector which has a highest multiplier effect. And that exactly is the reason why the government is focusing so much on infrastructure sector, because it can cause huge scale economic growth and employment generation. So in this present year's budget itself, if you see, you can see the government's capital outlay or capital expenditure actually increasing by 33.4%. It's substantial. The government has increased by 1/3 its capital creation expenditure. That's so great. And also government has said, central government is saying to the states that, see, if you want to create infrastructure, we will give you 50-year interest-free loans. Government has given something like 2.4 lakh crore for railways, which is the highest ever so far that we have seen. And government has identified sectors like ports, coal, steel, fertilizer sectors, etc., for infrastructure generation. All these type of things do exist. And the government also speaks about something like UIDF. I'll come to you, the UIDF. We spend about effective revenue expenditure, right? And effective revenue deficit. Similar to that, we have something called as effective capital expenditure. For example, it's like very similar. Effective capital expenditure is the capital expenditure of the union government plus the portion of the grant that is used for the creation of capital expenditures. That is, in the earlier thing, if you remember, we had something like 35 lakh crore as our revenue expenditure and something like 10 lakh crore as your capital expenditure. Of this 35 lakh crore, 5 lakh crore was given for states as grants, of which 3 lakh crore was used for revenue expenditure. So, and also 2 lakh crore was used for capital expenditure. This 2 lakh crore, you add to this 10 lakh crore, which becomes 12 lakh crore. That is what your effective capital expenditure is. In addition to your capital expenditure on the budget, you add that portion of the grants given to the states, which is actually used for the creation of capital expenditures. That's it. Now, the government also says about something about municipal bonds and all in this year's budget. So what is the idea of a municipal bond? A municipal bond is a very important concept and like a very interesting way of raising funds. You know what a bond is? A bond is like an instrument. What is basically a bond? Some money from me. Let's say I give 10,000 rupees to the government. Government will take a piece of paper and write, this guy, me, has given 10,000 rupees to the government. The government will repay this 10,000 rupees to me after 5 years. That's what the maturity of the bond is. And for all these years, the government will keep paying me 10% interest. So this is what a bond is. This is like an assurance letter for all these things. Now, so the central government has a habit of raising money through bonds. The state government has a habit of raising money through bonds. Now the governments are saying about municipal bonds. Why can't the municipal corporations, why can't the municipalities also raise money through bonds? So how would a municipal bond look like? I, a person staying in ABC corporation, let's say in Mumbai corporation, I would give my money to Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation and they would give me a bond. They would issue me a bond saying that they will repay this money after said period with said interest. That's how a municipal bond would work. Now, the advantage of a municipal bond is that the municipal corporation or the municipality who issues the bonds will have the money and they can use this money for their requirements. Otherwise, without something of this sort, this municipal corporation or municipality will have to depend upon the state government or the central government for their fund. This dependency can be done away with. But if I give my money to Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation, I think about something else also. I think, will this corporation, BMC, will they be able to repay me my money? Like, do they have ample amount of resources to repay me my money? That is something that I really think. And that's where the idea of ring fencing comes in. So the government says, you create urban infrastructure. Maybe you create something like parks, maybe you create something like parking facilities, etc., etc. Whatever you can think of, you ask people money from people and create infrastructure. And you ring fence, you charge these things. You'll collect user charges on this. And by that, you'll be able to collect money. And this money you can give to people as municipal bonds, like as the returns on the municipal bonds. By this way, or in this way, what happens? You can build the trust of the people, and people will be willing to give more and more money. That's the whole idea of the ring fencing and the whole idea of municipal bonds. Now, the government proposes about creating something called as UIDF, Urban Infrastructure Development Fund. What is this thing called as UIDF or Urban Infrastructure Development? We had something called as RIDF right from our 1980s, which is called as a Rural Infrastructure Development Fund. So we had discussed about priority sector lending in our classes on banking. So every banks are required to spend give around 40% of their lending, and some banks 75% as priority sector lending. So if there is some priority sector lending shortfall, they could give this money to RIDF instead of lending to these sectors. Similarly, the government is proposing you create something called UIDF. This would be managed by the National Housing Board to create the infrastructure in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. So the NHB will own something called as UIDF. If a bank has a PSL shortfall, if the bank has not met the requirements of a PSL, you can give this money to the NHB's UIDF, and they will use this money for the infrastructure creation in the rural areas, and thus there will be more infrastructure creation. See, not rural areas, urban areas. See, one problem that our urban spaces face is that of a massive congestion. People are moving to the urban spaces and people do not have good conditions to live. People do not have hospital facilities or any facilities of that sort. So you can think about developing all these type of things, the slum resettlement projects, or even healthcare facilities, education facilities for migrants, all these people in the urban spaces using these funds. Now, the government in the economic survey speaks about something very interesting. The title is Unfolding the Private Capital Investment Cycle. So, in the present decade, we are seeing that private capital investment is actually increasing. So, once the stresses of the COVID-19 starts clearing out, of late we see the private people are investing, the capitalists, the corporates are actually investing. So, but the survey identifies this as a phenomenon which has roots in the first decade of the millennium, that's the 2000s. In 2000s, what happened was there was a large amount of investment that was being coming about. And this investment was built on credit. Like the banks used to, the companies or the corporates used to take loans, and then they would lend and they would make investment, etc., etc., etc. But in the second decade, something happened. For this, I want you to definitely watch our classes on NPS, on banking. In 2014, we decided to do something called as asset quality review. And post the asset quality review, we identified the large existence of NPAs in the banks. And post the existence of identification of the NPAs, the banks became stressed. Now, the banks were not in a situation of that they could lend. You have the TBS problem, the twin balance sheet problem. The bank's balance sheet were problematic, and so problematic were the finances of the corporates also. So there was no room for the banks to lend, and there was no room for the corporates to spend either. So in this situation, what happened was they thought of clearing the dues, like clearing their balance sheet. And that's where government comes up with very interesting or like exceptionally revolutionary policy making, something like IBC. With all its shortfalls, this is one of the greatest economic policies that the government has come up, the NDA dispensation has come up with, the insolvency and bankruptcy fund. They come up with IBC, they think about relieving the debt from the bank's heads, and as a result, what happens? The corporate resolution happens, and now the banks have money and they are able to spend more, the corporates are able to spend more. That's what they identify. Now, another component of the achievement of Amritkal goals is a focus on the environment, the green economy or the green growth. So they introduce certain schemes called as PM Pranam, we'll discuss it. They introduce something called as a green credit program, we'll discuss it. Then there is something called as Amrit Dharohar, Mishti, etc., etc. To start with, then there is something called as Gobardhan. Gobardhan is a very simple scheme where you are thinking about creating many plants where the waste can be converted into energy. The waste to wealth plants we are speaking. What is Pranam? PM Pranam. Promotion of alternative nutrients for agriculture management yojana. That's what Pranam is. Alternative nutrients. Alternative to what? We are speaking about alternative to chemical fertilizers. We see a large amount of chemical fertilizers being used in our agriculture, and this has a whole lot of adverse environmental issues, adverse human health related issues, etc., etc. In addition to this has a huge fiscal issue as well. The fertilizer subsidy of the government is enormous, and the government is not at all interested in paying this fertilizer subsidy. It has become a huge burden for the government, and government has said, see, we have launching a scheme for the promotion of alternate nutrients. What nutrients? Biofertilizers, bionutrients, or natural. You are going to promote something like organic farming, natural farming. And as a result, to promote all these things, the government says we'll not have any separate expenditure on subsidies and all. What we'll try to do is, in the financial year, you see 2022-23, the government's fertilizer subsidy is 2.25 lakh. So this 2.25 lakh crore, the government is going to reduce, and this difference of the savings will be given for the development of aspects like or biofertilizers, bionutrients, etc., etc. That's what the government is proposing of late. Now, this is all about Pranam. Now, there will be no separate funding, but you can do the spending. And this is a very interesting article about PM Pranam that has come up in Indian Express. I would recommend you to read this particular article. Just go search Google and what is the PM Pranam scheme fertilizers, and read the tail Indian Express. They will have an explanation of this. I'll take a small break. It's very hot over here. I'll take a 2-minute break. Then we'll start back. So something else of importance on the green growth front is the green credit program. So this, just like the name says, it is a program which is intended to help mitigate the climate change, create the adaptive capacity, and improve the overall state of the environment by increasing energy efficiency and resource use efficiency. So the basic idea is, if there are any private sector corporates and all, if this corporate is undertaking any activity that is environmental friendly, so when you do that activity, you earn green credits, something very similar to the carbon credits and all. You earn green credits, and this can be used to meet your net zero goal commitments and carbon neutrality, etc. And you are going to create a national mega registry. This is going to be set up for all carbon instruments, which is potentially linked to international registries. You are going to need a national registry of this. Once you have a national registry, mega registry of all the green credit programs and where the green credit is created, you can link this to the international registries, and this can be used in for our meeting the requirements or the set means of the Paris Agreement and so on and so forth. So that's basically about the green credits program. Then there is another scheme which is basically about Gobardhan, that is galvanizing organic bio-agro resources. Then, and who implements this scheme is very important. This is implemented by the Department of Drinking Water and Sanitation. What is the objective of the scheme? It is to augment the income of the farmers. Even though the objective is augmenting the income of the farmers, it is not implemented by Ministry of Agriculture and Farm Welfare. What they're trying to do is they're trying about converting the biodegradable waste on the farms to compressible biogas. So then there is another scheme which is called as Mishti. Mishti is basically, it's the mangrove initiative for shoreline habitats and tangible income. So the idea is about develop mangrove plantations along India's coastline and on salt banks. So this, as a result of the Mishti scheme, it will create large number of mangrove plantations. And this is for sort of like a convergence between schemes like Narega and Kamba Fund and all. So what we are thinking about is developing afforestation. And as a result of this afforestation, thinking about creating coastal mangrove forests, and you're thinking about integrating tourism into that as well. That's where Amrit Dharohar comes into the picture. Amrit Dharohar says that you're speaking about ecotourism. You use your wetlands optimally. You try to develop your mangroves and make sure that there is a tourism opportunities being generated on all these things. And a tourism opportunity basically means a better income to the local communities. That's about Amrit Dharohar. Now, something else, this is not connected with the environment. This is about the next pillar, which is about the financing aspect of all these things. When you're speaking about tourism, when you're speaking about employment generation, when you're speaking about investment, you should also speak about where the money is going to come from and how are you going to finance. The financing side should also be there. In that, something that could be very important for the prelims is something called as the NFIR, or the National Financial Information Registry. See, the idea of this is going to be a registry which has a large amount of financial information. So the idea is it's going to give a 360 degree of kind of information. That is, if I go and approach a bank, let's say State Bank of India, for some loan, they will have very limited information about me, financial information about me. They are not interested in knowing my personal information. They'll be interested in knowing about only my, largely my financial information. They will have financial information about whether I have taken any loans from SBI, how good is my CIBIL score, very limited information. What NFIR tries to do is, it is trying to create a registry where all my financial related information will be there. Where all have I taken money from? Where all have I have money? What are my sources of income? So if I go and approach any random bank, SBI or Canara Bank or HDFC Bank or whatever it be, if I go and approach this bank, they can just have a look at this NFIR and say and understand whether I'm creditworthy. And based on that, they can understand, they can decide whether to fund me or not. So this will improve the speed of credit flow. This is the whole idea of something like an NFIR. And the survey and budget both speaks about creation of data embassies. Data embassies are a very interesting concept. I did not know much about this data embassy some time back, but I happened to hear a lecture by a government official from Estonia. That's when I started digging a bit on the data embassies. So you must have studied in your internal security topics that the Estonia suffered a massive cyber attack in 2007 around period from Russia. So during this period, almost all the Estonian government servers, everything was taken down, and the Estonian government, the Estonian nation as a whole, suffered terribly. And as a result, after that, the Estonian government started digitizing their economy, and the Estonian government is considered to be one of the most digitized nations in the world. Why am I speaking about all this? I'll come to that. Keep the Estonian story aside. Now, I hope all of you know something called as IFSC, the International Financial Service Center. We have something of that sort in Gujarat, which is called as GIFT City, the Gujarat International Financial Tech City, where an IFSC, something like GIFT, is a specially delineated area where what you would do is there are a whole lot of financial activities or a lot of finance-oriented services which would cater to the needs of only the offshore clients. You are not going to deal with domestic clients, you are going to deal with offshore clients. For example, banks meeting the requirements of foreign investors, all these type of things. So something that would fit in GIFT is a data embassy. The government in the budget says, you think about developing more data embassies in the GIFT City, and that will give you an excellent income. If that means a growth GIFT City and excellent growth of the Indian economy, how would that be? And what is data embassy, and how would that fit in the story of GIFT? See, the data embassy is a way to secure critical data of a nation, an alternative place or a location. So the Estonian government, what they did was like, they thought create an alternative location. The Estonian nation is a nation. Even if you capture the entire nation, the nation can still survive because the nation need not have their entire data sources, their digital architecture. The entire nation is digitized and their digital architecture have backups around the world. This is part of a business continuity plan if you're speaking about a business, or this is part of a disaster recovery plan if you're speaking about a nation. For example, you take the case of India. Delhi is our capital, and we are storing all our data. And if by chance there is some nuclear attack on Delhi, the data servers are lost, and the nation can't function. It's like our entire governance structures, everything gets lost. But on the other hand, if you have backup of this in different parts of the world, suppose if you have backup of this data server in Tokyo, in Sydney, Cape Town, etc., 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 then even if one of your senders, data centers, is lost, still you can function. One of your data centers, which is Delhi, if it's lost, still you can function. So what you would do is, you would go to Tokyo, and there would be firms who will be providing, because this is just like an embassy. You are giving you the nation's, like your sovereign's information, and they are holding it for you, and there are going to be very strict privacy constraints. There will be firms who do this. You give this, they will maintain your data, they will maintain the servers for you. You do, but you can't just rely on one nation. You go to one nation, Tokyo, you go to multiple nations, and you create data embassies around the world. Now the system is such that even if you don't have control over Delhi, even if Pakistan takes control over the servers of over Delhi, you can still run your nation. So this is the idea of a data embassy. So there are places where there are excellent data embassies. So data embassies is a service that can come into the mold of gift cities, and if that succeeds, that's going to be very good income for the gift cities. And the government speaks about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. The basic objective is about agriculture productivity, creation of public goods, and trust-based governments, and more private sector participation, and thus promoting the ease of business, and not just ease of business, the ease of living, which would go improve the efficient resource allocation and has the productive potential of your economy. Now, what has happened on the front of inflation or the rates? We'll have a look at it. We were speaking about synchronized monetary policy tightening, if you remember. We said about triple shocks. The third shock was the synchronized monetary policy tightening. So after the Ukraine-Russia war began, the monetary policy, the policy rates around the world started increasing in order to control inflation. That had to happen in India also. So to control inflation, our policies also started going. So this is, we'll have a look at the green color one is the repo rate. The repo rate started going up. I know you know the relationship between the rates, inflation, growth, etc., etc. If no, go and watch our classes again. Then you have MSF, which is following the same trend. But here you see a break. What is this break all about? See, till April 2022, the lower floor of the LAF or the liquidity adjustment facility corridor was something like fixed reverse repo. What is a reverse repo? Reverse repo is like that is if a bank has a surplus amount of money, if they want to park this money with the RBI and if they want to make some interest out of it, they could park it over there and get money out of it. That interest rate is what you call as a reverse repo rate, right? But then why is there a break over here? Around this period, April 2022, the RBI introduces a new instrument which is called as SPF or the Standing Deposit Facility. See, what is a Standing Deposit Facility? Standing Deposit Facility says any bank or a financial institution can park, like banks can park your excess money with the Reserve Bank of India. You will get an interest rate on that. But the thing is, when compared to reverse repo, In reverse repo, the RBI would give you some collateral. Here, the RBI will not give you some collateral. The intention behind introducing something of this is to make sure the RBI do not face collateral issues like the collateral shortages. RBI has been facing it for some time. It is to solve over this issue. But thinking from a bank's perspective, RBI is one of the most credible agencies around the world. You need in India for sure. You need not be concerned about whether RBI is going to repay your money or not. They are definitely going to repay. So with collateral or without collateral does not make much sense anyway. But SPF rates are actually higher. If you are asking RBI collateral, you get the banks get a lower rate, and if you are saying you don't need a collateral, you get a higher rate. Which means from now on, no banks are going to choose the reverse repo route. Instead, they are going to choose the SDF route, and that's how this has become the new floor, and that's why you see a structural problem. That's the whole story. Now, coming on to the inflation front again, you have three inflations over here. The headline inflation, food inflation, core inflation. This is just to give you an idea about how these three inflations will pan out over any period of time. The red colored line graph speaks about headline inflation. That's a normal inflation encompassing everything. So you see deviations. True, there are deviations. Like on the lower front, it goes as low as somewhere close to 4%, and on the highs, it goes up to as high as 8%. Let's call it a 4% deviation. Reasonably good deviation. But when you have a look at the food inflation, you realize this is not a total deviation actually. The lower end of the food inflation is somewhere close to 0%, and the higher end is somewhere close to 9%. This is more than double of the deviation that exists in the headline inflation. The headline inflation has food inflation and all other inflation that we're speaking about. So this leads to the conclusion that the major amount of inflation or the inflation is largely happening on the food and the fuel component. To consolidate that even further, you have the green colored plot, which is that of core inflation. Core inflation is that part of headline inflation which eliminates food inflation and fuel inflation. Once you eliminate food and fuel inflation, the upper bound is something like 7% and the lower bound is something like above 5%, less than 2% deviation, not much deviation, which basically means that the major inflation is happening on the food component and the fuel component. That's why, that's it. And to consolidate this even further, you have a sub-index of your CPI, which is called as CFPI, or the Consumer Food Price Index. This has been highly volatile over the past couple of years. Now, another thing or another concept that needs clearing out and for which survey has spent out substantial amount of time is regarding the convergence of WPI and CPI. So I hope all of you have an understanding of what WPI and CPI is. If you have some confusion, if you're not clear about this, please go and watch our classes on inflation, where I have been stepped in detail about what WPI is and what CPI is. Understanding these two indices are very important to understanding the whole economy and obviously to clear this examination in the prelims, it's for sure. Now, what is the convergence of WPI and CPI that we're speaking about? One problem with these two indices is they consider different type of products. For example, CPI considers services, WPI does not consider services. CPI consider the consumer's price inflation, WPI considers the wholesaler's price inflation. Due to all these things, there are divergence at times. That is, WPI will go in one direction and CPI will go in one direction. Ideally, these are two indices of inflation, which means they should move together, right? Both moving upwards means inflation is increasing. But you think about the situation, CPI is moving up, WPI is moving down. Which means one index is saying there is inflation, one index is saying there is no inflation. What is to be interpreted out of it? It's a very tough call to interpret. And one index says there is inflation, other index says there is no inflation. How are you going to make monetary policy out of it? That becomes an even tougher question for that. So now of late, we are seeing a convergence in this WPA and CPI. It is because of the fact that CPI inflation has been increasing because the prices of services has been increasing of late. Services attain a major weight, and also in WPA, the components that have a larger weight in WPA, their inflation is reducing. Now we are of late, we are seeing a converging. So here, this does not have much things, but just to give you a context. So you need to understand a couple of figures around here that will do. One thing is, what is the government's expenditure, social service expenditure by the general government? General government means center and the states. So of the total expenditure, if you take, around 26% of the government's expenditure is going for social services expenditure. Social services basically we are speaking about health related expenditure and education related expenditure largely, and some other incidental expenditures there too. So a quarter of the government expenditures goes for social services, and as a percentage of GDP, if you have a look at this, is somewhere close to 8%. So just keep these two figures in your mind. That's it. And you have very two important indices that you can never ever afford to miss to study for your prelims. One is HDI, or the Human Development Index, which we have done in very much detail in our classes on poverty and inequality. And also another index is something called as MPI, or the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which also we have discussed in our classes on poverty and inequality. Now, when India's HDA score 2021 came, we were not satisfied. We got a rank of something like 132. That's a very dismal rank. And compared to our rank 1 year before, that's 2020, it was 130. It has went 2 steps down. That's nowhere to be satisfied. And what government says is that government have the usual explanation. Government says that it's COVID and every nations are suffering. Every nation score has went down. But see, your rank has went down. Other nations are performing better than yours. That's not acceptable. And you see, the South Asian average is something like 0.632, and we are like 0.633, like slightly above average. You can't call it above average. It would be a shame if some minister comes out and say India's HDA scores are greater than the South Asian region's average, because the increase is just 0.001. Compared to the world average of 0.732, it's much, much lower. We have a whole lot to improve. And this speaks about India's life expectancy at birth, which is less than the world average. India's expected years of schooling, which is again lower than the world average. India's mean years of schooling, which is again lower than the world average. And India's national per capita income, which is much, much below the global average. So these are certain things that we definitely need improvement. That's what the survey chapter on social security says. And this chapter also says about multidimensional poverty index. Multidimensional poverty index is a very different kind of index, which is actually calculated by OPHI, which is the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. So you're having a look at how deprived are you on these indices. So 2019-21 data would say around 60% of the Indian people are multidimensionally deprived. Multidimensionally deprived means you are deprived on more than 1/3 of the indicator. And what is the total number of people? Around 23 crore people in India are still multidimensionally poor. That is not a figure that is acceptable. Even after 75 years of independence, we are speaking about 23 crore people for multidimensionally poor. That is nowhere acceptable. And the level of deprivation is something like 42%. Now, here also we have something that could be very much important for prelims. One thing is called as out-of-pocket expenditure. What is this term called as OOP, or out-of-pocket expenditure? Suppose you go to a hospital, get admitted for 4 days. The hospital bill comes up to be something like 1 lakh rupees. Of this 1 lakh rupees, let's assume you have an insurance. Your insurer pays something like 70,000. You get some government subsidy. Let's assume that is something like 10,000. And the remaining you pay, which is something like 20,000. So this 20,000 is your out-of-pocket expenditure. Putting in percentage terms, this GHE is the government health. GHE stands for government healthcare expenditure. THE stands for total healthcare expenditure. OOPE stands for the out-of-pocket expenditure. This 20,000 means 20% has been spent out of your pocket. 10% is spent out by the government. But this may not be how it works out. Actually, if you're going to a government hospital, you might have to pay a very minimal amount and the government will take the maximum amount. On the other hand, if you're going to a private hospital, you will not get anything from the government. You will have to pay almost everything from your pocket if you don't have an insurance. If you have an insurance and you go to the private hospital, you will have to pay a small amount and the insurer will have to pay a higher amount. So the idea is about which type of medical care you are seeking, about which type of institution you are seeking, that the percentages vary accordingly. But still, we have taken out averages. In around 2013-14, our out-of-pocket expenditure to total healthcare expenditure was something like 64%. It was very unacceptable. And that is something that you call as a catastrophic health expenditure. Why you call it catastrophic health expenditure? Because there are many people in India, many households in India who live just about poverty line. Suppose this is your poverty line, they live just above it. They are barely on subsidies. Suppose if they are out of job for 1 week or maybe 2-3 days, they go below the poverty line. That's how dire the situation is. Now, here, what happens is, these people you're speaking about, suppose if they have some health issues, if they are forced to spend some amount of money by taking loans or debt from someone else, they become poor for the remainder of the year for a substantial amount of time. That is why you call this health expenditure as catastrophic. Because all those who are on the verge of poverty goes into poverty once a health expenditure comes in. So it is very important from the perspective of the government to reduce people's out-of-pocket expenditure, and government takes the maximum burden on the health expenditure of at least this population. And that's why the government has introduced schemes like Pradhan Mantri Ayushman Bharat or the National Health Policy Mission, etc., etc. And the government has reduced it to somewhere around 48%. Keep this figure in your mind. So the solution to reducing out-of-pocket expenditure ideally is to increase the provision of government health expenditure. Like you increase the number of government hospitals, you increase the number of government clinics, you increase the spectrum of services provided by the government hospital. That is your ideal solution. But if you can't reach the ideal solution, the next solution is you promote insurance. And that too, government insurance you should promote. Private insurers have a whole lot of problems. If the government is not doing it, then the only option is private insurance. They ask for a high premium, which is beyond the affordability of a large section of population of India. And even when the premium is affordable, there comes a whole lot of other problems. Problems like you can see, in many cases, it is seen that the insurers look to reasons to reject the claims. They find some random reason and reject it. To solve all this, the solution is either government healthcare provision or government insurance. Now, regarding trade, the survey has certain trade trends and all, but they are not as vivid as it used to be in earlier years on the trade figures. So something on the trade openness has to be there. What is trade openness? Trade openness is the ratio of exports plus imports divided by GDP. You take exports, you add the value of exports, add the value of imports, you divide it by the GDP, you get something called as trade openness. Now, India has been a nation which is historically known to be having a very low trade openness. Very low trade openness means you have been closed to trade for a substantial amount of time. So what does this mean? Of late, India has been catching up. The world average trade openness is something like 56.5%. And it said about the presentation that I was listening to the Estonian official, the Estonian nation's trade openness will be stunned. It's around 140%. So high. In India, the figure was very low before the 1990s, but now we are catching up with somewhere around the range of 45%. Initially, in the 1980s and all, it used to be around 12 to 15%. Well, now we have improved a whole lot. Now, when we have a look at our export performances, in the world merchandise exports, our share is something like 1.8%. That is, if you take the whole world's merchandise exports, like goods exports, India's share is dismal. But when it comes to it's 1.8. When it comes to services, it's slightly better at 4%. 4% is decent actually. So, which means this is something that you should be very clear with, and UPSC has asked questions on this in 2020 prelims. That is, what is the situation? Like, where do we export more and where do we export less? Like on services, we are a good enough exporter, but on merchandise component, that is not the case. What about imports? Same story. The story that holds true for exports imports is like 2.5 and services imports is something like 3.5. And if you have to look at India's ranking in world trade, on merchandise export, we are something like 21 and imports 14, whereas on services export, we are ranked 7th in the world. And this is the basic data to give you an idea about how much India receives remittances around the world. India is the world's leading remittance receiver for around the past, every year in the past decade or so. Now, speaking about forex reserve, but now it has come down, especially as a result of global prices going up. The different reasons are like the global commodity price inflation is one reason to account for. Another reason to account for is the rupees exchange rate depreciation. All these things, our import cover has now come down. And these are some metrics that you need to keep in your mind that could be helpful for the examination. Our external debt to GDP ratio is somewhere around 20%. And in our external debt, 80% of the debt are long-term debt. Only short-term debt is only 20%. So, and also around 97% of the short-term external debt. That is, we said 20% of our external debt is short-term. In that 97% is in the form of short-term trade finances, like trade finances in the sense that I'm like export or an importer. I'm importing something from US. So when I import something, I have to pay the money, right? But I would say I don't have money now. I'll pay you after 6 months. That's what you call as trade finances, trade credit. So 97% of it is coming in the form of trade credit. So that's not an issue. And of it is denominated in US dollars. 30% of it is denominated in Indian. And only in our external debt, only 20% is actually the government. So many government which are very important. One term is insurance penetration and the other one is insurance density. Insurance penetration means the ratio of total insurance premium to GDP. That is, you take the premium amount. For example, in India, if the total insurance premium paid in the one financial year is something like 100 crore, you take that on the numerator, you take your GDP figure on the denominator, you multiply it into 100, you get insurance penetration. Premium amount by GDP. That's insurance penetration. Then you have another metric which is called as insurance density, where on the numerator you have the same figure which is this 100. On the denominator, you have your total population. That's your insurance density. On the denominator, if you have Density, you're speaking about, on the denominator, if you have population, you're speaking about insurance. Density, on the denominator, if you have GDP, you're speaking about insurance benefits. Another couple of terms, one is financial contagion and the other one is pent-up demand. See, the idea of financial contagion is something like, what is a contagious disease? A contagious disease is something that spreads, right? Similarly, financial contagion is something like an economic crisis, the impact of which can spread to other nations. Or if there is a financial crisis in some locality, it would spread. That's what a financial contagion. Survey uses this term, so it could come up importantly. Now, another we have something new automobiles, new electronics, mobile phones, etc., etc. But when COVID came, there started to be a whole lot of uncertainty. They started to be concerned about whether they will have the same level of income for the futures to come. Then they thought like, okay, we'll do one thing. We will push this demand for quite some time. But once the COVID-related issues or the lockdown and all started easing, people started to have more of confidence on the economy. They started spending. So the demand increases, the spending actually increases. This is a spending that has been kept pending for quite a time, and now it is being spent. That's what we call the pent-up demand. So by that, we come to the end of our discussions on budget and economic survey. So we have had a look at the static portion of the budget initially, then we had a look at the major aspects in our economic survey and budget. But to be very frank, many of the aspects, be it regarding components on inflation or components on NPAs, understanding those requires a bit of static content, which is a bit beyond the potential of a couple of hours of classes. That's why I have given you exact references. For example, when I was referring to CPI, WPI, I was referring to, in case you have doubt, which class you have to go and go back and watch. In case of NPAs, which class you should go and watch. If you have any doubts on any of the conceptual domains, please do that, and then the things will be more clear. By that, I wind up the session, today's session for budget and updates and so on. Thank you.